Salem is known as one of the most haunted places in Massachusetts because of the witchcraft craze that took over there in 1692 and the terrible things that happened because of it. In 1629, it started as a peaceful fishing town. The name Salem came from the Hebrew word Shalom, which means peace, and for a while it lived up to that name. But then the Puritans showed up, and things got a little complicated. The town started by the water, and this area became known as Salem Town. Later, some people moved to its inner parts to start farms, and their area became known as Salem Village. Salem Town was full of rich merchants making money from imports, exports, and inns. Meanwhile, Salem Village was made up of farmers who felt like they were doing all the hard work, like growing food, but getting nothing in return from the township people. To make matters worse, the villagers had to travel 12 miles to go to church and do other town duties, which was a big deal back then because, well, there were no cars. By 1666, the farmers were fed up. They begged for freedom from Salem Town, but the town wasn't having it. Salem Town didn't want to lose the valuable resources the village provided, and they definitely didn't want to start paying for those resources. On top of that, they had some big religious disagreements. In 1662, something called the Halfway Covenant was introduced. Before this, becoming a full member of a church was like a really tough game. You had to confess all your sins in front of the whole congregation and share your conversion experience. But with the Halfway Covenant, people could confess privately to their minister and are still considered to be church members. The modern folks in Salem Town liked this, but the villagers, who were the old-school Puritans, were angry. They believed the Halfway Covenant went against everything they had worked so hard to build. Now, this is where it gets more interesting. There were two of the most powerful families in Salem Village, the Putnams and the Porters. The Porters were the richest family in the area, owning 2,000 acres of land and making tons of money from the town, even though they lived in the village. They were all about the Halfway Covenant and keeping things cool with Salem Town. But the Putnams? They hated the Halfway Covenant and were not fans of Salem Town. They owned 800 acres of land and didn't see why they should keep paying taxes to Salem Town when they weren't getting anything out of it. They thought the town folks were losing their way, focusing too much on money and not enough on God. So in 1670, when Salem Town decided to build a new meeting house and wanted the farmers to help pay for it, the Putnams and others were like, "No way." They refused to cough up the money and even went to Boston to complain. After 2 long years, Salem Village finally got permission to build their own meeting house and hire their own minister. It was a small win, but the tension between the Putnams and the Porters only got worse. To make matters worse, Thomas Putnam died in 1686, and everyone expected his fortune to be split among his 9 kids. But surprise, surprise, he left everything to his second wife, Mary, who was the daughter of Israel Porter, the Putnams' arch-enemy. This meant that a big chunk of the Putnam fortune ended up with the Porters, which only increased the rivalry. Then came Reverend Samuel Parris, who became the minister of Salem Village during the Witchtrials. Reverend Parris had a complicated past. He was born into a family involved in the African slave trade in Barbados, and after his father died, Samuel tried to run the family's sugar business. But when a hurricane destroyed most of the island, the sugar market crashed, and Samuel had to find a new path, which eventually led him to Salem Village. And the rest, as they say, is history. In 1680, a smallpox outbreak hit, and it was bad, like really bad. Samuel had to admit defeat, sell everything, and move back to Boston with his family and their slaves, Tituba and John Indian. However, back in Boston, Samuel met with his old college friends who were part of the Puritan movement and tried to make a living as a merchant. But eventually, he started training with his uncle at the Boston Puritan Church. That's where he met a man who told him about a family looking for a minister for their town. That family was the Putnams, and that town was Salem. Samuel wasn't ordained yet, but he thought he was up for the job. So in 1689 he traveled to Salem and was ordained by the community. They were happy to have a good Puritan man in their midst who could scare the people with the right amount of hellfire and brimstone. Now Salem had just gotten the okay to have their own church and minister, and Samuel was their choice, even though he was actually at the end of a very long line of ministers who didn't work out. But that's a story for another day. Once Samuel got to Salem, he started causing some trouble among the already troubled citizens. He didn't believe in something called the halfway covenant, so he refused church membership to anyone who practiced it and even denied them communion. This made him an enemy of the powerful porters, who, in turn, refused to pay Samuel's salary. They wouldn't even give him firewood to keep his house warm during the freezing New England winters. Samuel considered himself a very God-fearing, devoted man, so it's not surprising that when his daughter and niece came down with a sickness that doctors couldn't explain, he turned to an otherworldly source. In the winter of 1692, Samuel was living with his wife, 3 children, and his sister's 12-year-old daughter, Abigail, whom he took in after her parents were killed by Native Americans. It seems like Abigail and Samuel's daughter, Betty, were experimenting with something called the Venus glass technique, a way to tell the future and find out who your husband would be. The girls became terrified when they saw the shape of a coffin in the glass. Not long after this, Abigail began having fits. She'd twist and scream, saying some unseen force was tormenting her, before collapsing. Soon after, 9-year-old Betty started showing the same symptoms. Samuel didn't know what to do, but he was afraid. This wasn't the first time he had seen something like this. A few years earlier, in 1688, when he was living in Boston, Samuel had been called to the house of the Goodwins. Their 4 children had started showing the same symptoms, writhing, screaming about invisible hands torturing them, almost having seizures before collapsing, exhausted. During their fits, the Goodwin girls cried out that they were being attacked by their neighbor, Goody Glover, an elderly woman from Ireland. Goody Glover, whose real name was Anne, worked as a housekeeper for John Goodwin until his 13-year-old daughter, Martha, accused Anne of stealing laundry. After an argument, Anne cursed Martha. After this, the girls all became ill, and the doctor who saw them said it must be witchcraft, since he had no other explanation. Goody Glover was arrested, charged with witchcraft, and hanged on November 16th, 1688. Samuel Parris racked his brain to think of a similar situation in Salem, where his household might have been cursed. He remembered a time not long ago when Sarah Good, a woman who had been reduced to poverty after her first husband died, came to his home with her small child, asking for money. When Sarah Good was turned away without a cent, she muttered something under her breath, which obviously must have been a curse. Finally, the Parris family physician, William Griggs, was called to examine the girls. After almost a month with no improvement, he claimed that he found no physical ailment that could be causing their symptoms and thought there must be something evil at hand. Then he just left, leaving the family to think about that. On February 25th, 1692, Samuel and his wife went to church to pray for the girls' conditions, leaving them with Tituba, John Indian, and a neighbor, Mary Sibley. Mary, a mother of 5, wanted to help. She remembered an old remedy from England. She instructed John Indian to collect urine from Abigail and Betty, baked it with flour, and made biscuits, which were fed to the family dog. The idea was to pass the ailment from the girls to the dog, but instead, the girls' symptoms worsened. Their convulsions increased, and they began to yell that they were seeing a dog shape attacking them. When Samuel and Elizabeth came back home and saw the girls were worse, they were freaked out. When they asked the girls who was hurting them, both girls claimed it was Tituba. Samuel went to Tituba with these accusations, and she promptly blamed Mary Sibley for the urine biscuits. Samuel was livid that a member of his congregation would practice black magic under his roof. Word spread around town quickly, and Samuel called in a few other ministers to inspect the girls. These men went home, telling their families, friends, and neighbors that there was a witch among them. The story spread like wildfire, bringing fear and suspicion to everyone it touched. 2 days later, the niece of William Griggs was walking into town on an errand for her uncle when she felt she was being followed. Her name was Elizabeth Hubbard, and as she sped up, she saw a wolf. Not a normal wolf, but a witch's familiar. It was large, dark, and had glowing eyes. She ran the last few miles home, realizing that it belonged to Sarah Good. Elizabeth told her uncle that Sarah Good's dark servant had been following and watching her. Along with Sarah Good, Elizabeth accused another woman in town, Sarah Osborne, of harassing her. Thomas Putnam, the man who brought Samuel Parris to Salem, went to the Parris home to see the girls for himself. He was terrified. When he got home, he told his wife and 12-year-old daughter, Annie, about what he saw. Soon after, Annie herself fell ill with the same symptoms. It's almost like she just copied what she heard her father say. But Thomas Putnam knew what had really happened. The devil had followed him home. Now, witchcraft is a crime, punishable by unaliving. You have to provide solid evidence when accusing someone of being a witch. You will also have to post a bond to support your claims, meaning if you can't prove your accusation, you will lose your money. So, if you are going to accuse somebody of witchcraft, you'll have to cough up a lot of money and then provide proof. If your proof isn't convincing enough, you'll lose your money. And because of this, a lot of people stopped accusing others of witchcraft. But when Thomas Putnam and his buddies went to the magistrates and started pointing fingers, they didn't pay any bond or provide evidence, yet arrests were made anyway. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba were all placed under arrest and charged with witchcraft. They were thrown into prison, and their examinations were scheduled immediately at the New Salem meeting house. The whole town of Salem gathered to watch, and as the trials gained attention, people also traveled from outside Salem to watch. It became a race to see who could accuse who first. And if you had something to gain from accusing another person of witchcraft, like maybe settling an old score, that would even be better. Now, Annie Putnam went on an accusation spree. Remember, the Putnams don't like the Porters. First, Annie accused the 5-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. Annie claimed she saw little Dorothy Good holding the Devil's Book and asking her to sign it. Not long after that, Annie pointed the finger at Elizabeth Proctor, a pregnant mother of 5. As at then, Elizabeth and her husband, John, were managing an inn in the village. They were also part of the wealthy Proctor family, who were arch enemies of the Putnams. Elizabeth was smart and kind, but there were a few dark marks on her record. Her grandmother had been accused of being a witch 3 decades before, so there were already whispers that dark magic was in her blood. Plus, she was known for allowing Native Americans to come into the inn and drink, which caused alarm among her neighbors. Native Americans at that time were considered godless savages, agents of the devil. When the Proctor's servant girl, Mary Warren, heard about the allegations made against Elizabeth, she added more. Mary was 18, an orphan the Proctors had taken in, but she always complained about being mistreated by them. On March 12th, Mary testified that the specter of John Proctor had floated around the house before settling in her lap. John Proctor was a no-nonsense kind of person. He thought the whole witch trial thing was ridiculous, and so when his own servant girl made claims that could get him and his wife thrown into jail, he told her that if she didn't stop with her foolishness, he would beat it out of her. Mary stopped for a while, but she later returned, accusing Martha Corey, the wife of Giles Corey,